Hello, friends. My name is Peter Rosenbaum, and I'm here with my friend and colleague Julia Hanes, and we're talking about some reflections on the editorial we co-authored for the June 2025 issue of Developmental Medicine called "Making Visible Disability: The New Normal in Health Professionals." And I think it's fun for us to have a chance to reflect on this out loud and with a longer time than the minute it takes you to read the editorial. Let me briefly introduce Julia, who brings a number of complementary perspectives to this discussion. Julia is a physician training and going into her actually going into her fifth year in physical medicine and rehabilitation. She also is a Paralympian who holds several Canadian and international recognitions and awards and records for her work. She was at the 2024 Paris Olympics in several events and is an outspoken, analytically thoughtful, critical critic of the issues that we want to talk about today. So, as our Canadian broadcast colleague, um, what's his name? Brian Goldman is a physician who has a radio program and talks about his view of the issues from his side of the gurney. Julia actually has views from both sides of the gurney. So, my question to you is based on your life experience from both sides of the gurney as a physician and as somebody with an acquired impairment, how do you get involved in these issues? Why are these issues important to you?
Thank you. So it's interesting. I acquired my disability at the end of high school. So I was 17 years old. And up until that time, I hadn't given obviously much thought to this. And then spent the better part of 2 months in the hospital, many, many months after that in rehabilitation outpatients. I've seen probably hundreds of physicians and healthcare providers at this point in my journey. And one of the pieces that really stood out to me upon reflection is I have never seen a physician who looks like me. I've never seen a physician with a different walk who's using mobility aids. And when I was thinking about applying to medical school, and ultimately when I got accepted to medical school, one of the challenges was trying to figure out, A, is this even possible for me? Or is the ceiling well below this medical education that I would want to reach? And this has kind of come into play several times now throughout my clinical practice, where um, especially in the past year and a half, I've seen people with childhood onset disabilities, with spina bifida, with cerebral palsy, who are in their 60s and have really lived through this evolution of the disability rights movement in Canada, who, not in any way related to my clinical care of them within the first 5 minutes, asked me if the wheelchair that I use is actually mine, kind of in disbelief that there's a physician who looks like them practicing, peppering me with questions about whether I had my disability when I started medical school and what that admissions process was like, with this intuitive understanding on their end about how many barriers would be in place that most able-bodied people would not think about off the hop. And within, minutes, their realization that they were actually seeing a physician who looked like them began to cry and were so moved just to see themselves represented in the system that they've participated in as patients on that side of the gurney their entire lives. And it really prompted this reflection on my end that it is very important to see people who look like you doing things within the systems you participate as physicians, as lawyers, as teachers, as public service workers, as politicians. It's something that so many within the disability community get denied on a regular basis that most of us take for granted.
I remember, and it's interesting when I listen to you talk about this. I remember an experience in 1974 when I was a young physician looking after a baby with spina bifida. And I examined her, talked with the father. I'd known the family before, and she'd come back to hospital for review. And I said, my colleague, Dr. So-and-so, will be in a minute to look at Nancy. And in wheeled my colleague who had spina bifida and who was a physician. And the father just about fell over. Um, and I didn't think much of it because I knew Dr. T and I knew another colleague who was a wheelchair user. Dr. T had a child onset condition. The other colleague had an acquired condition. But I took it for granted that that was possible and never gave it the kind of thought that you've just described. So, mea culpa.
Yeah, it's interesting because especially and maybe an interesting reflection about the acquired disability, right? If imagine if that dad had seen physicians his whole life and teachers and people with disabilities participating in society in meaningful ways, in the same ways as everybody else, then I think having a child who has a disability obviously carries with it some challenges and some weight. But I think the assumption about what their quality of life would be and what their aspirations can be is inherently different. And I think being able to see people with disabilities represented helps normalize the disability experience for the entire population and actually makes acquiring disability, either through yourself or family members, an easier adjustment. Um, yeah.
Yeah. You wanted to ask me a question.
Yes. So I think one of the other pieces that we've reflected on as we've done this editorial and now in preparation for this podcast is what movements have come before us. So we've seen historically when we reflect on medicine that there are many groups, not just the disability community, who have been excluded from participating in medical education. We think about women, we think about people of color, people of all different religious and ethnic backgrounds who have added so much to our medical world through their research, through clinical practice, through their leadership roles, and so on. And I think, as a female as well, I reflect upon a time where women were not allowed to participate in medicine. And if they were met with so many assumptions, and justifications that were ultimately proven to be quite sexist about their competence, their toughness, and their emotional ability to handle the job. And so my question to you is, what parallels do you see between some of these exclusions and this history of exclusion and some of the ideas about how we move forward to include people of all different disabilities within our medical system?
There's an aphorism which I like and use a lot and have written about. It's not my aphorism, but the idea, if I hadn't believed it, I wouldn't have seen it. And I think that in the past, without ever justifying any of the things that you're describing, there were beliefs in society at large about women, about people of color, about people with religious and cultural differences. And those beliefs then led to people seeing things in certain ways and not being imaginative. What I think is happening in the current, not fast enough, by the way, but in the current era, is that we're challenging some of those assumptions. And despite the current political nonsense going on south of the border, diversity, inclusion, and equality, and so on, are much more prevalent in people's thinking. There's a long way to go to actualize those things, but we no longer, I think, are as prepared to tolerate the exclusions that we still do with respect to people who are functionally different, or who look different, or who sound different. And the neurodiversity movement is one example of that. It does not mean that everybody who's neurodiverse has equal capability, but it means that we're being challenged to at least consider the possibility that just because you are identifiable in this or that way does not mean you are less of a person or less of a capable individual.
I wonder, when you talk about EDI initiatives, one of the things that I've noticed is we often um, they really are excellent, and we've seen, especially in the past 5 years, I would say, a shift in our approach within medical education, at least within the institutions that I've been a part of, around a desire, a very outspoken desire for difference, whether or not that difference is necessarily um, tolerated in the same way once it's in is maybe a different discussion. There's probably a lot of room to grow there, but there's at least this appetite for difference. I've noticed that the accessibility or the A on EDI often gets dropped or forgotten about. And I think that that speaks in some ways to how hidden disability has been within medical education settings and institutions and healthcare more broadly. Um, and so, one of the things that I will challenge our listeners to do is if you're a part of any of these committees, ask yourselves, do we have representation of disability in a broad way? Are we working towards accessibility broadly? You know, disability is the largest minority group that anyone can become a part of at any time. And sometimes, you people are referred to temporarily as temporarily able-bodied or TABs. So, the accessibility really goes beyond the disabled community and is actually for everyone when they may or may not need those functional adaptations.
I think that's a really important point, and one that I know you and I have chatted about. It has been our experience in the setting in which I work that it has been a bit of an uphill climb and remains an uphill climb to get people who preach and practice DEI and inclusion to recognize disability as part of that. And that's, I think, partly because DEI has been politicized in many ways, probably appropriately with respect to the challenges faced by people who are ethnically or racially different from the majority. But to exclude or to not actively include people with disabilities, I think is a shortcoming that needs to be addressed, as you have just challenged our listeners to do. Um, you have many, many stories. I should have said also, by the way, that Julia has a wicked sense of humor and sees the nonsense in some of what her life experience has been about. Could you talk a little bit about the challenges you faced having applied to, been interviewed at, and accepted in medical school with your visible left hemi syndrome, and then being challenged to prove that you actually could get there?
A great point. And Peter, you were obviously very involved in that process as well. So, as he said, I was accepted to two medical schools in Ontario, which um, I was very, very proud about. I accepted one of the offers. And then when I disclosed my diagnosis, and as you said, Peter, it's very visible and very obvious to anyone who has interviewed me. And anyone actually in the process would have known about it. Um, I was met with a huge amount of fear that was largely unjustified and was also met with technical standards, which are this set of organic ideas that you must be able to speak and see and hear and move in a certain way in order to be a physician, justifying the exclusion of people with disabilities that may require significant clinical accommodations, but not necessarily preclude their function in clinical teams. And so um, that idea that I will not be able to do this because I do not meet this functional requirement of being able to move both hands and both feet in a neurotypical way or in a normal way, quote unquote, um, sparked a months-long battle about whether or not I would be allowed to pursue medical education in any way. I was sent a Excel spreadsheet of 200 items that I had to prove that I would be able to do before starting medicine, including things like two-handed knot tying, starting IVs, delivering babies, intubating, some of which I was able to prove I did, and others, such as the two-handed knot tie, were obviously impossible for me, but also not required to be a physician. There are so many clinicians who, if you ask them if they ever knew how to two-handed knot tie, would tell you they couldn't. Um, and so this sparked this really interesting thought for me of I have up until that point had developed a sense of pride in how far I had come in my recovery and my functional capability, and was then met with this idea that I was incapable, unable to do things, and would not make a good physician as a result of my disability. And I'm one of the fortunate ones who got an interview, was accepted. There are so many barriers to even get to that point that people don't acknowledge and don't talk about. Um, and I think we need to start to think about how those barriers impact which trainees we accept and who is allowed as part of this exclusive, and again, in quotations, group. Um, because right now we are certainly putting up a number of barriers to people who I believe have potential to be absolutely incredible clinicians.
We discussed in preparing for the podcast the idea that the word ableism doesn't appear in our 650 words, and that led to some interesting discussion between the two of us. Do you want to say a little bit more about that and about attitudes? Because I know you are very thoughtful academically as well as socially about these ideas.
Yeah, I think it was an interesting reflection because I had almost assumed that we had put that word in. And again, in so much of my research work and advocacy work, I use the word ableism all the time. It sums up so many of these things that we know, both as working in and with people with disabilities and their families, but also as a person navigating the world. This bias that exists, that discriminates against people with disabilities, we often have been tiptoeing around within so many spheres of society, and ableism just like anchors it for people. What I think is really interesting is Heather Feldner's group out in the University of Washington has done a study on the Project Implicit through Harvard. This is an implicit bias test. You can go and take it online if you Google implicit bias disability attitudes test. They surveyed thousands of providers, from physiotherapists, occupational therapists, diagnosing clinicians such as physicians, nurses, etc. And when they asked people, do you hold bias against people with disabilities? The vast majority, 60%, said, I have no preference towards or against people with disabilities. And then when they looked at their implicit bias scores, it was astounding that, in fact, only 10% actually had no preference. And the vast majority, 44, and then 29%, uh, respectively, either strongly preferred non-disabled people or moderately preferred non-disabled people, and another 12% slightly preferred non-disabled people.
You have the bar graphs that
Yeah,
people can see.
yeah. I have the bar graphs, and it's surprising in some ways how strong that bias is. And I think when we conceptualize, implicit bias, we start to learn as kids, and then it gets solidified in our personal life experience, in our educational experiences, in our social and work experiences, and really becomes solidified. And unless we actively work to undo that, it becomes something that influences all of our decisions, our clinical discussions, our teaching of other professionals, and our engagement with families. One of the ideas that we talked about a little bit is this idea of implicit versus explicit bias. So explicit bias is our understanding of our own attitudes. So do I have or hold bias that I acknowledge to any specific group of people? And implicit bias is this unconscious attitude that lives below the surface, but may influence our behavior. So, the disability attitudes test has been done uh, through Project Implicit through Harvard for many, many years. And what has happened is there's a huge amount of data um, produced by this Project Implicit and tied with demographic characteristics, including whether or not people are healthcare providers. So Dr. Heather Feldner's group, including Dr. Friedman and Van Pumibuk, the name pronunciation there is not correct, but apologies. They analyzed this data, and what they found is that the vast majority of healthcare providers did not identify any explicit bias. They had no preference when asked whether or not they preferred non-disabled or disabled people. But when they took the test, something different emerged. The majority of clinicians and healthcare professionals did hold implicit bias. And in fact, almost half strongly preferred non-disabled people. And this was under the surface. This is a piece that I think is really important, a really important piece of evidence for us as clinicians practicing evidence-based healthcare that we hold, we, including myself, hold bias against people with disabilities, whether or not we know it. And so it's important to learn where we hold those biases and how we can start to address them in our own clinical practice.
Thank you. That's very powerful.
The other piece that's really interesting is the disability paradox. And if people haven't heard of this, it's this concept coined by Albrecht and Driver in 1999 that demonstrates that people with disabilities, even significant disabilities, actually have quite high to normal quality of life. And when you ask able-bodied people, physicians included, what their quality of life would be, it's consistently rated far lower than the people actually experience. So we know we hold this bias. We have a huge amount of ableism in our education systems, and we have this presumption about the quality of lives and the types of lives people with disabilities can lead. And so it's interesting that, despite all of this research, we aren't talking about these ideas a little bit more and acknowledging the limitations of our abilities as healthcare providers.
It just would I want to clarify for listeners that the idea that Julia is talking about is that the that people with disabilities in the Albrecht and Devliger study were self-reporting their quality of life, and that was being contrasted with the external valuations of their quality of life made by other people. In other words, those of us who are able-bodied can't imagine that somebody who has a difference, such as needing to use a wheelchair or a visual impairment, can self-report a good quality of life. And that speaks to the ableism and the bias, quite frankly, the prejudice that we have against people with disabilities, and is a profoundly important issue for us as health professionals because most of the people we work with have health problems. I mean, that's a statement of the obvious. But if our view of those health problems is a negative one, or one based on pathos and diminishment, then we are not able to serve people as well as we could be if we understood their predicament from their point of view. Um, what can we do? This can be thought about as a pretty depressing discussion. What can we do? What do you see happening that gives people hope?
I think there is so much happening within the disability and medical education spaces right now. And the more we can engage as a group, as a collective of people, especially the listeners here who are clearly interested in these topics of disability, engaging in the docs with disabilities campaign and group, listening to the Docs with Disabilities podcast, acknowledging and learning and unlearning so much of our implicit bias that we hold for people with disabilities, I think goes a long way when we're talking with trainees and families, acknowledging our limitations and being able to assess their quality of life. We are not the experts, and I think it's important that we acknowledge that. I think the other thing that perhaps is interesting is if we force, and I say the word force, lightly, but um, force the hand of people by saying we want evidence-based understandings of disabilities to be taught in medical school environments. We want to talk about the quality of life of people with disabilities. We want to talk about the true challenges that people face navigating our systems, um, and how disability is a social determinant of health, I think is really important. The other piece is for anyone listening who's involved in medical education, we need to actively seek out qualified applicants who have disabilities to help us address our own gaps in knowledge and understanding and help provide equitable access to spaces that have historically excluded this group of people who has every right to participate in our clinical environments and practice.
This. My advice in closing to listeners is to watch for Julia Hanes. She is a force to be reckoned with, not just because she is a role model, but because she is academically, socially, and intellectually very thoughtful and critical of the issues and is an important contributor to these issues going forward. So I want to thank my friend and colleague, Julia, somebody I hope to continue to work with over many years. And thank you for listening.
Thank you so much.